Well, as my mentor in political fundraising used to say, well, shit. The hell are you going to follow that? I will say, my friend, I've been doing this for a long time, and nobody has ever asked me to talk more, ever. So congratulations. And the only good news about following Tasneem is I invited her. One of the oldest lines in Hollywood is never follow kids or animals. And so now we're going to add never follow Tasneem Raja on stage. It's an amazing story. And it's what gets us up in the morning right now, is there are more and more and more stories like it. Not exactly like that. But it is because we need to think about our local news institutions as fundamentally civic rather than commercial that we began the American Journalism Project. And I can't think of a more sort of emblematic enterprise than the one you're undertaking in Tyler. So we're eager to learn more. I'm going to try to go fast. I'm going to try to stay on time for three reasons. One, I learned a lot yesterday, a lot. And one of the most hopeful things I learned was just how deep and urgent the audiovisual crisis at the American Journalism Project is, which is another way of saying our slides suck. They're terrible. And so I don't know when you guys have the time to make these beautiful decks, but we don't have one, and so I'm going to try not to subject you to them. I say hopeful, though, because we've raised $42 million in a little about 9 months with a really crappy deck. And so that must mean that we're in a moment. And we do think we're in a moment where, again, our society is coming to realize the importance of local news and that our local news institutions need to be thought of as fundamentally civic rather than commercial. Second reason I'm going to stay on time is to stay in the good graces of this guy. Rosenthal, I met with Rosenthal on September 15th of 2008, which was the day Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. And I said, we're going to do this nonprofit thing we think we may call the Texas Tribune. And he said, I'm in. Didn't know me from Adam. There was no Evan Smith at that moment. There was nothing. I don't know what Portuguese is for I'm in, but it's the way this guy has lived his life, and you've been our champion and our conscience and our spirit animal, and I can't thank you enough. And so the third reason I'm going to try and go quickly is a lot of you have seen this before, some version of it, and so I'm going to try to focus on amplifying a couple pieces of the story that I don't think we've told as well, and then on giving you a brief update, which will not, as Jim or as Neil Chase said, will not include the announcement of our first 5 grants. So we really believe in a public service media that is sustained by, governed by, and looks like the public it serves. And we believe that standing up that at the local level is going to require a movement in journalism philanthropy. And that last part, looks like the country it serves, to us is a moral imperative, but it's also a business imperative, because we really believe that in order to sustain this movement in journalism philanthropy, the thing has got to look like the public it serves. Otherwise, that movement will never be sustained. Here, sorry about that. The proximate objective is to raise $50 million for a first fund to stand up or help 25 or 35 what we're calling civic news organizations. We've raised, as I said, $42 million to date. The grant agreement that we signed with Jennifer and Alberto said it's a $100 million project. So we've got a long way to go. I'm not going to dwell on the problem. We've we've heard a lot of that. I will say there's one new take on it that, come back. There's one new take on it that I heard this week that I thought was really interesting, which is even if you take the sort of squishier and leftier inclinations that I have about the importance of local news out, and you think of it just on a good government and accountability, or put a good government and accountability lens on it, think about this. 2/3 of the taxes in the United States are levied and spent within 70 square miles, which is Washington, D.C. The number of reporters covering that activity over the last decade has stayed relatively constant, arguably has gone up. The other third of taxes, though, are levied and spent in the other 3.5 million square miles in the United States. And the number of reporters covering that motion has gone down by a half, 2/3, in some places as much as 90%. Do you think there's more fiscal responsibility going on in those places? Do you think that decisions with regard to resource allocation are being made more with regard to racial, gender, social equity? Doesn't seem very likely. So what we talk about is a billion-dollar problem, and it's oversimplified, but never let that get in the way of a good story. We think that $2 billion roughly has come out of what we call news gathering spend at below the federal level over the last decade. Our friends at Facebook and Google and other places say, well, you can do more with less, and so you don't need the whole $2 billion. And so we did. We rented a supercomputer and crunched a bunch of numbers and said, fine, we'll cut it in half. So we're saying it's a $1 billion a year problem. What we're trying to do is catalyze the reinjection of $1 billion a year back into local news gathering. And this is an important distinction about what we're trying to do, and it's something that we're going to have to, it's not easy to communicate. But we're not funding, or we're not proposing, we haven't done anything yet. We're not proposing to fund newsrooms. Let me say that again. We are not going to fund newsrooms because we believe that when journalism philanthropy funds newsrooms, journalism philanthropy pretty much guarantees that it's going to continue to fund newsrooms. And so what we're attempting to do, at least, is to fund integrated media organizations that have diverse revenue streams, or to help what are essentially newsrooms shaking their tin cup today become integrated media organizations with diverse revenue streams. These are the three solutions that often get proposed. Not a lot of news there. Lots of hooray about Chalkbeat in the Texas Tribune. This is, I think, really, really, really kind of the most exciting, in some ways, data we have today, which is that this is where the growth is. Nonprofit news organizations at the local level, particularly, this is where an infinite percentage of the growth in the local news ecosystem is today. Started on a small base. But by the time we're done, by the time we're trying to give the money away starting in December over a period of 2.5 or 3 years, by the time we're done, the number of these organizations is going to be easily twice that, which means we're going to serve a very, very, very small portion of those, sort of like Stanford undergraduate admissions percentage low. And it's, as I said, it's a small base, but 10 years ago, when we started the Tribune, we sort of got patted on the head, and all the brilliant people in the news media said, this is kind of cute, but this is just a particularly bad recession. We're going to fix this. Maybe nonprofit news will represent a bridge to, some greater thing. Kind of a French fry. 10 years later, I'm here to tell you, it ain't the French fry. Nonprofit news is going to have to solve a big, big part of our local news problem. And if you think it's trivial, consider this. Sue Cross at INN, her membership's aggregate budget in 2018 was about $400 million. Digital newspaper subscriptions that we heard a lot of talk about yesterday, if you take out the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, in aggregate, that's about how big that market is. And so the nonprofit news ecosystem this year may be bigger than digital subscriptions and newspapers. So it's not trivial. What we're talking about is an infrastructure that looks a little bit like public radio, about $1 billion in size, potentially 1,000 or so outlets, which is what public radio approximately has. This is how public radio is funded. What we're saying is take government funding, which in the fullness of time, maybe there should be a public policy shift that would address part of what we're talking about. But in the meantime, it's got to be philanthropy. And so think of target funding, a target revenue mix of, and I would say more like 20 to 40% or 20 to even 45% in each of three buckets: from the audience, from commercial sponsorship, from philanthropy. The point of the right-hand side of that chart is just to say it's not as heavy a lift as necessarily, or as you might think. So I'm gonna end there and just give you the briefest update on us, on the American Journalism Project. We will, with any luck, have our sort of criterion and processes for grant making communicated to our community in June, probably June 30th, I were guessing, and make grants, our first maybe 3 or 4 in December. So that's sort of the cadence that we're on. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate all of you, and everything you're doing is more than I can tell you.